Hi everyone, and welcome back to Music Theory. In this module, our first module, we're going to review a couple things: triads, seventh chords, chord inversion, and what are called diatonic chords. So how we think about chords when they are all in the same key. So the objectives for this video are to review the building and identification of triads and seventh chords, review chord inversion, what it means to invert a chord. Finally, to review what it means for chords to be diatonic. We also relate this to what's called Roman numeral analysis. How do we assign that Roman numeral to the different chords that exist in a key? Now, this is a review, so I'm going to just kind of go through this quickly, since this should be a refresher from last semester. Now, if you do have questions, we will have a chance to go over it in the sessions and stuff. So if this doesn't, there are things that are not quite clear, that's okay. Just, you could write those questions down and we can go over them together. Okay, so let's start with triads. A triad is just a chord with three notes. And what really makes something a triad, besides the fact that it's three notes, is that the notes of the triad are all a third apart from each other. Okay, and a third is just an interval that are 3 lines and spaces from each other on the staff, which we'll see. And as we know, there are 4 types of triads, and each triad has a different combination of major and minor thirds, and also the kind of fifth that is produced from those different minor thirds. So what defines a triad as a different type is the kinds of intervals that make it up, the kinds of thirds and the kinds of fifths that make it up. Okay? The most common triads that we see all the time are major triads. It's one kind, and it has a major third on the bottom and a minor third on the top. And when you combine those, when you go up a minor third and then a major third then a minor third, you end up with a perfect fifth. So here is a major triad built on the note F. So that's F on the treble clef. In order to make it major, we need to go up to a major third above that F, which is an A natural. So now we have, and then to complete it, we need to add something that is a minor third above that A, but it's also a perfect fifth above that F. So we end up with a complete triad. Okay, and we would call it just F, right, or F major, an F major triad, because it's built on F. And this often is said to sound happy. The other kind of triad that's really common is the minor triad, and this kind of flips the intervals. So on the bottom we have a minor third, and on top we have a major third. And again, just because we're just flipping those, it still creates a perfect fifth between the lowest note and the highest note in this triad. So if we were to build this on the same note F, the first thing we need to do is add a minor third above it, which in this case would be an A flat, not an A natural. And then we add our major third, that's going to be A flat to C, and that gives us our complete minor triad, which sounds kind of sad. Okay, and then the chord symbol we use is an F with a lowercase m to indicate that it's an F minor triad. Okay, and then we have 2 other kinds of triads that happen. One is diminished and one is augmented, and these both sound kind of dissonant a little bit. So a diminished triad is made up of a minor third and then another minor third. And since these thirds are a different distance than our other thirds, when you combine them, it creates a diminished fifth, so a fifth that is slightly smaller than it should be. So if we were to build a diminished triad on the note F, we'd start with F, add a minor third above it, which is A flat, and then add another minor third above that, which in this case will be a C flat, which creates this sort of tense sound of diminished. Okay? And we use a little F with a circle next to it to represent that in chord symbols. Okay? And then the final one is the augmented triad, and this is made up of the only other combination of thirds we can have, which is a major third and another major third. And since a major third plus a major third is bigger than a fifth, slightly bigger, we call it an augmented fifth. So to spell this chord starting on F, we'd have F as our root, and then A as the third, major third, and then we'd add another major third above that, which will be a C sharp. And we get this really kind of spaced out weird sound, which is pretty unusual. We don't hear that a lot. And we use a little plus to say that this is slightly bigger than it should be. It is augmented. Okay, so those are the 4 most common kinds of triads. Let's go over quickly how we identify the different parts of a triad. They each have a different name. The lowest one, whenever the chord, the triad is, looks like a snowman, it's said to be in root position, which means that the lowest note is considered the root of the chord. So in this case, since these are all stacked up as thirds, we're not rearranging them yet, the lowest note will be the root of the chord. So the root of this chord is that note D. The note that's in the middle, that's a third above the root, is called the third of the chord. And then finally, the note that's on top, the one that's a fifth away from the root, is called the fifth of the chord. Okay? And triads are always named after their root and their type. So since the root of this chord is D, and it is a minor triad, we simply call it a D minor triad. Okay? So those are triads. Let's talk about seventh chords. Seventh chords are simply made up of a triad that we all saw before, and then you add another note on top, which is a third above the fifth, which makes it a seventh above the root. So that is the seventh of the chord, which is why we call this a seventh chord. So they have 2 parts. They have a triad, which are the bottom 3 notes in root position, and then they have another note, which is the seventh above that root. Okay, and again, they are named after their root and their type, and this is a minor seventh chord, which we'll talk about right now. So we call this a D minor seventh chord. So there are 5 common types of seventh chords, and they are defined kind of in the same way as the triads, but we really want to think about these as simply being defined by the kind of triad that's on the bottom and then the kind of seventh that's on the top. Okay? So here are 5 Fs, and we're going to spell our 5 most common seventh chords on these notes. So let's start with the major seventh. The major seventh chord always has a major triad on the bottom and then a major seventh between the root and its seventh. Okay, so in this case that would be an F major triad on the bottom, and then to make it a major seventh chord we simply need to add the note E natural because that's a major seventh above the F. So we end up with this nice sounding major seventh. Okay, with chord symbols we simply call it the name of the chord, F, and then the type. In this case, we'll use capital M and 7 to represent the fact that this is a major seventh chord. Okay. The most common kind of seventh chord that we'll see is this one, the major minor seventh chord, also known as the dominant seventh chord. And it will always have a major triad on the bottom, just like the one before. But what makes it different is it has a minor seventh between the root and its seventh. And so we'll have our F major triad again, but then we'll add our minor seventh on top of that, and it creates this really tense kind of sound. Right? That sounds like it needs to lead somewhere. That's the defining quality of a dominant seventh chord. Okay, now we can call it an F major minor 7 like that. Often I will just write F and 7. That is sufficient as well. Okay, one more kind. We have a minor seventh chord, and this is simply a minor triad and a minor seventh. So to spell this on F, we'd have an F minor triad on the bottom, and then we'd add a minor seventh above that to make it into a minor seventh chord. And we just write F with a lowercase m, 7 to indicate a minor seventh chord. Okay. There are 2 others, and they both have the word diminished in them. The first is called a half diminished seventh chord, and a half diminished seventh chord always has a diminished triad on the bottom and then a minor seventh on the top. So to make this on F, we start with our diminished triad on F, and then we add our minor seventh above that. So it gives us a half diminished seventh chord. And we use a little circle with a halfway slash through it, and a 7 to indicate that this is a half diminished seventh chord built on F. And then since there's a half one, there has to be a fully diminished one. And a fully diminished seventh chord simply has a diminished triad. And then it also has a diminished seventh between the F and the seventh. So to spell this on F, we'd have our diminished triad again. But now we want to lower that E even further. So whenever you lower something that's minor further than it should be, it gets even smaller, so we call it diminished. So to make that E into a diminished seventh, we have to make it an E double flat, which creates our fully diminished seventh chord. So those are the 5 common types of seventh chords. And again, going through this quickly because this should be a refresher. Okay. Oh, and then we use the symbol a full circle this time since it's fully diminished to indicate that this is an F fully diminished seventh chord. All right, so let's review what might be one of the trickier things about triads and seventh chords and stuff. And that is that they can all be in different positions. So what we've been looking at so far is what's called root position for triads and seventh chords. And that just means they look like snowmen. They're stacked up nicely, right? They're made out of thirds. But you can also move those notes around. And it doesn't change what kind of triad it is. It just changes the order that the notes are in. So the notes of the triad can be moved around to maintain their identity. They're still triads, they're still major, they're still minor, they still have the same root, but the notes can be moved around so that a different note is the lowest sounding note. So the ones we've been looking at so far are what's called root position. So what's here is a root position triad built on G. And in that position, it's really recognizable what it is, right? And so that has a third between the G and the B. So if we wanted to kind of keep track of the interval contents here, we could say that this has a third, but it also has a fifth. So if we wanted to write that down, we could also use the number 5, okay? So one common way to represent something is in root position or indicated is to simply use a bass note, right? Its lowest note, and then write a number next to it. And that's what we call the figured bass of this chord. Okay, so you could write out all the notes, but you could also just write the note and a number, and it tells you what it is. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second, but those are the intervals that are in that chord, a fifth and a third. It's also possible to flip this around so that the G, that root, is no longer on the bottom. And if we do that, we call it first inversion. Okay, and first inversion has the third of the chord on the bottom. And if we keep track of what's in this chord in this position in first inversion, it has a third between its lowest note and the next note. So we could write 3. And it also has a sixth this time, not a fifth. So we could write a sixth. Okay. And then if we could use a shorthand to just write the note B and then tell us what intervals we need to play above it, and that would be the figured bass of it. And then finally, you can rearrange the notes so that the fifth of the chord is on the bottom, and we call that the second inversion. And if we looked at the notes that are, the intervals that are in this chord now, in this arrangement of notes, right, we have a fourth, and we also have a sixth, so we could use the number 6/4 to represent this chord, okay? And again, these are all the same triads, but we're using these numbers to indicate what position that triad is in. So they're all G major triads, but the first one is root position, the one in the middle is first inversion, and the last one is second inversion. Okay, so we kind of shorten these numbers a bit. So whenever you see a G by itself, right, in our figured bass, since the fifth and the third are so common, we will say that we don't really have to write the numbers. Okay, you can just leave it blank, and that will indicate that there's a fifth and a third above that note. For the first inversion, we'll abbreviate this to just have a sixth, since the third is a very common thing. So the shorthand for that figured bass number is 6. And then with the second inversion, we do have to write 6/4, since there's not a fifth and there's not a third in it. We have to correct or indicate that neither of those common things are there, and in fact we have to have a sixth and a fourth. So that's the practice of figured bass. And these figured base numbers are used with chord symbols, which we'll look at in a second. So they'll all go with these Roman numerals. So here we have different Roman numerals that tell you the root of the chord, which we'll talk about in a second, but also the inversion. And we don't have to write out first inversion. We can just use the number 6 to indicate that it is in first inversion, or the number 6/4 to indicate that it's in second inversion, and then no number to indicate that it is in root position. So those are triads. Now you can also invert seventh chords. And again, I'm going through this quick because we've already done this. And then seventh chords have similar positions as well. We have root position, which has a 7, a 5th, and a 3rd in it, okay, which we can just call a 7 in our figured bass. For first inversion, when you flip this chord around, the 3rd's on the bottom. So we have a 3rd, we have a 5th, and a 6th as well. So all those intervals are 6/5/3, which we can abbreviate to 6/5. Second inversion has the 5th of the chord on the bottom, and the interval content here is a 3rd, a 4th, and a 6th. So we call this 6/4/3, and we abbreviate that to simply 4/3 in our figured bass. And then the final arrangement of notes in this chord are what's called third inversion, which has the 7th in the bottom, and that has a 2nd, a 4th, and a 6th in the intervals, so 6/4/2, which we simply abbreviate to 4/2. Okay, lots of reasons why we're kind of leaving out certain numbers and stuff, which we can talk about if you want to. We kind of went over it last semester, so we don't need to dwell on it. And then these also are used with the Roman numerals. And so whenever you see a Roman numeral with a 7 above it, doesn't necessarily have to be the V in this case, but with the Roman numeral 7, then it simply indicates it's a root position 7 chord. Roman numeral and 6/5 just means it's a first inversion 7th chord. The Roman numeral and 4/3, that just tells you that it is a second inversion 7th chord. And then the Roman numeral and 4/2 just means that it's a third inversion 7th chord. Okay. All right, so those are the inversions and the figured bass that goes with them. Now let's talk about those Roman numerals we've been hinting at. The Roman numeral, again, going quickly, just tells you how the chord is related to a particular key. In other words, which note of the scale is that chord built on. So in the key of D major, the triad that you build on the first note of the scale gets the Roman numeral I, which stands for the number 1. So the root will tell you the Roman numeral to give to that chord based on where that root is in the scale. Okay, so in D major, since we're building a triad on D, D is the first note of a D major scale, so we give it a Roman numeral. Now it's capital because it's major, okay? And if we keep going, right, this E minor triad, it's minor and it's built on the second degree of the scale, the note E, so it gets a lowercase 2, okay? If we keep going, we'd have lowercase 3 to indicate the third chord of this scale, right? And it's minor. When we get to something like that G chord there, that's major, so we give it a capital 4. It's built on the 4th degree. This A major chord is built on the 5th degree of the scale, and it's major, so we still give it a 5, right? Capital 5. And then we have our 6th, which is minor, built on the 6th degree. And then finally, this last one, this C sharp E G, that's a diminished triad, so it's built on the 7th degree of the scale, so we give it a 7, lowercase, and a little circle to indicate that it is diminished. So the Roman numerals tell you a lot of information in a really small amount of space, right? They tell you, first of all, which note of the scale the chord is built on, what kind of chord it is, and then if you include the numbers, they can also tell you the inversion of the chord. Okay? And since these chords are all diatonic, which means they're in a particular key, all the major keys will have this same pattern of triads. Okay? In minor keys, it's a little bit of a different pattern, and that's because minor has different notes than major, obviously, different interval pattern. And then it does get kind of confusing. We kind of talked about this a little bit, but like the 6th and the 7 of a minor scale can either be sharped or lowered depending on context. And so the book, I think, rightfully just picks some common ones and sticks with those, and that's what we'll do too. So here's our D minor scale, right? Notice I included a C sharp because we always use harmonic minor when we're dealing with harmonies. The first one, the first triad you build is a minor triad, which is 1. The second one, since you include that B flat, is a diminished 2. Then we move on to our major 3 chord built on F. Our 4 chord is minor this time, since we have to include that B flat. And this is the tricky one that everyone always forgets. But since you have to always raise a leading tone in a minor key, the 5 chord in minor will always be major. You'll never have a lowercase 5. You'll always have an uppercase 5. Okay. Then we have our 6 chord built on B flat, which is major, so we make it capital. And then this final one built on the C sharp, we just call that a 7 fully diminished, since it's built on C sharp. So there's some similarities between major and minor because some of the notes that C sharp comes from a major scale, right? But it also has to be combined with the elements of the minor scale. So it does get a little confusing with that. Okay, and again, since these are diatonic, they're all in a minor key. Every single minor key will have the same pattern of triads. Okay, and then the last couple things we'll talk about are the 7th chords in major keys and 7th chords in minor keys. Okay, so let's start with, go back to all the D major triads we had before. If you added a 7th to the first one, you'd get a major 7th chord by adding that C sharp. Okay, so we use the uppercase M and 7 to indicate that. On this 2, right, if you added a D to that chord, you'd end up with a minor 7th chord. Minor 7th chords are just indicated by a 2 and a 7. Again, you have another minor 7 chord there. And then on this 4 chord, it's a major chord, so it's capital, and you simply add an M and a 7 to indicate that it's a major 7. And then here, this is the important one. This is a 5, and it has a 7th as well, but it is a dominant 7th chord, so we don't add the M because it's not major. So whenever it's dominant, we simply write the number 7. Okay? And then with this 6th chord here, it's another minor 7th chord, so you can just write the 7 since the Roman numeral is already minor. And then here we have our half diminished 7th chord built on C sharp. So those are the kinds of 7th chords that happen in every major key. Again, I'm going fast because this is all review. And then finally, with you can do the same thing in a minor key. And here are the most common 7th chords in a minor key. Okay, again, number all those. The 1 chord is going to be a minor 7th chord, so that'll be a lowercase Roman numeral with a 7. This is a half diminished 7th chord, this 2 chord, so we'll indicate it with our little half circle 7. This chord built on the F is our 3 chord, that's a major 7, so we'll just write an M7 there. Then we get a 4 chord that makes a minor 7th, so we have a lowercase Roman numeral and a 7. And then here, this is a minor key, but we still have a dominant 7th chord because we still have the C sharp. So again, in a minor key, the 5 chord will always be major, and the 7th chord built on the 5 will always be dominant. So we just write a 7 to indicate that it's dominant because it's also a capital 5. Okay, and then our 6 here is going to be a major 7, and then finally we end with a fully diminished 7th chord built on C sharp. And since they're diatonic, every minor key has the same pattern of 7th chord types. Okay, so a lot of stuff just got reviewed. But again, hopefully this just kind of jogs your memory about this stuff. I know that we still had a little bit of confusion about certain things that I just went over last semester, and that's fine because this isn't really easy stuff. It's okay to be confused. So again, if you have questions about this, we'll go over it in the Zoom session, and we'll spend some time doing activities and stuff to kind of go over this further. So I encourage you, if there's anything you didn't quite understand, you can go back in this video, rewatch it and stuff like that, but also hold on to any questions, which we'll go over in person. Okay, well great, thanks for watching, and hopefully that helped jog your memory a bit. And yeah, so have a great day. Thanks so much.